Okay, so greetings for the day. This is the part three of Why Nations Fail. Let me first share my screen. Right. So, in today's lecture, first, before I give you that what do we plan for today, let me give you a very quick recap of part one and part two. So, we started with a basic question in all of development economics, that why are some countries rich and others are poor. We looked at that specific chart showing that GDP per capita from the year 1000 to 2000. Let me go to that chart for you because that is the most important chart of this book. Mm, Just let me change my slide. Yes, here it is. So, the lay of land. This is the most important graph of this book. We started off with this graph, and this chart actually showed that GDP per capita from the year 1000 to 2000, and for almost 800 years, we saw that everybody was roughly at the same level, which is like they were not having that good GDP, and hence we can say that they were poor. But then something has happened, something around the 700s and 1800s. And suddenly, the Western offshores, such as America, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, just shoot up like at a tremendous speed. So Western Europe also followed it, and Latin America moved up, but much more slowly, as you can see in this chart. Importantly, as we are a part of Asia, so Asia stayed flat for a long time before starting to rise. And Africa, which was once, uh, at the top, at least in thousands, now we see that Africa basically has stayed at the bottom for the whole time. So the question is, why this divergence? Why did some places, why did some countries took off and others didn't? So to understand that, we have already discussed the colonial historical cases as well. So we went into history. We looked at how the Spanish colonizer in Latin America, such as Mexico or Peru, found dense populations like Aztecs, and their actions were based upon strict rules and regulations. So they took over existing hierarchies later on by enslaving the people and using them for the labor. So that was easy to do so because these were already organized. So they were you can say that they were sedentary societies with established power structures. Talking about the Spanish, they just put themselves at the top as well. In contrast, if you talk about North America, the English people couldn't do the same thing. The hunter-gatherer tribes of Virginia and Carolinas, couldn't be forced into gang labor. They actually um, went in the forest. So the English colonizers were in a very difficult position. They had to attract settlers, and to attract settlers, they had to offer them, something. So they gave 50 acres of land to each settler, and then, they also gave the political rights, as we have discussed before. So the General Assembly of Virginia in 1619 was the first representative assembly in the Americas. And that chain of event eventually led to the Declaration of Independence and US Constitution as well. So the starting point of institutions mattered enormously, and we also saw that the legacy of colonial forced labor, the Mita system in Peru, which we have studied, um, shows that the poverty levels are still uh, statistically measurable today, even after the centuries. So we started off why people are poor, but still, poverty still exists. It has not ended. So then we asked that is this gap about the culture? Is it because of the religion? Is it because of the work ethic, or some kind of geography? Like there could be some climate problems. There's some disease problems. There's some tropical conditions, and the author of this book says no. And here is the key evidence that the Latin Americas was actually richer than the North America as late as the mid 1700s, as you can see in this chart. And Mexico City, let me tell you, was one of the grandest city in the world. So if geography or culture explained everything, Latin America should have been, richer. But the geography and culture haven't changed. The divergence came later, and it came because of the core of this book, the main idea, i.e., I can say that it is institutions. So, talking about the BRIC framework, we went into the big framework in the part one and part two, and that brought us to the central framework of the of this book, the distinction between the inclusive institutions and the extractive institutions. When we spoke about the inclusive economic institutions, we were referring to secure property rights, rule of law, free markets, open entry for new businesses, access to education, and opportunity for the broader population. On the other hand, when we talked about inclusive political institution, we are actually referring to broad political participation, and in other words, the word for that is pluralism, which means that there are checks and balances, and there is an independent judiciary system, and there are constraints on rulers, and they cannot do what they want to do. Extractive economic institutions, on the other hand, means that there is insecure property rights, just opposite to inclusive economic institutions. Sorry. Mhm. So on the extractive economic institutions, which mean that there are insecure property rights, the monopolies, they are entry barriers, and the playing field is not natural, not fair. So there is a rigged playing field that is going to benefit small group of people, such as elite. Extractive political institutions, just opposite to inclusive political institutions, means that power is concentrated in the hands of few people, where there are no checks and no balances and no rule of law. And we call it absolutism. So, as we saw, that these tend to gather and reinforce each other. So, inclusive economic institutions plus the inclusive political institutions are the most stable and virtuous combination. We have studied it. And extractive plus extractive is also reinforcing, but in a vicious downward direction. So, the direction also matters. It should be upward and positive, and it should be virtuous in nature. We saw that the inclusive institution drive growth through investment, um, efficient market structures, and importantly, we also discussed creative destruction, where new forms are replacing the old ones. New technology is replacing the old technology, but it has a cost attached to it. And that is exactly where we will pick up today with the question of why, if inclusive institutions are so beneficial, then why don't all the countries just adopt them? That is the puzzle, and that is the basic question that if all of the world knows that inclusive institutions are so good and so beneficial, then why some countries are poor? So I'll quickly move to now my slide 12, from where we are going to begin part 3 of our book. All right. So, uh, growth under extractive political institutions. Why powerful people resist good institutions? This is the first question that we need to answer before we actually dive into it. So, the central intellectual contribution of this book, I would call, is that this main question: then why powerful people resist good institution? And this is, this is the slide that, in my view, contains the most important idea of this book. And once you understand it, you will start seeing it everywhere around you. So the main thesis is simple, that growth is much more likely under inclusive institutions than under extractive institutions. And we have established that. But here is the problem. Growth and inclusive institutions, while they create overall prosperity, they also create winners and losers. And the people who stand to lose are often, the elite class or those who are very powerful. So they will fight very rationally, very strategically rather, to prevent the change. If we talk about the losers, we can again, bifurcate the losers into two types. One is the economic losers, and the second one are the political losers. So these are the people, the economic losers are the people who will lose their income at large, such as they have established a monopoly, so they are going to be threatened that in case of change, they will lose their monopolies or their market position because of some institutional change, or you can even say of new technology or new lot of educated people. Uh, just like the textile manufacturers in early industrial England, who uh, actually you know overcome the new looms, the uh, those because of the mechanization, and they were actually afraid that because of the mechanization, their livelihoods was threatened. So think about it as any cartel or monopoly that benefits from the protected market. So when you open up the economy and you allow free entry, you enforce competition or competitive environment, you are enforcing strong law, these people would actually lose because their monopolies rents will disappear. So their protected position is actually destroyed. Secondly, and the most importantly, are the political losers. The political losers are those people who will not just lose their incomes, but the political power as well. So they are going to lose their unconstrained control over the state because of growth and institutional change that has supported it. And that is what the author of this book also calls the fear of creative destruction. So, not just economic Uh, Losers create creative destruction, but the political creative destruction also takes place. Um, Let me explain a little bit more. Like if your population is poor, uneducated, economically dependent on you, they will vote for you, they will obey you, and they will support you further. But if development gives them education, empowers them, give them independent incomes, they have more access to information, and they have alternative sources of credit or to get employment, they will become politically independent because they will no longer need you. And that is the most terrifying part to some political elite whose power rests on the dependence on the uh, votes of the people or the population on the large. So, let me, also discuss a bit about the situation in Pakistan because in Pakistan as well, there still exists some feudal lords. And if we talk about feudal lords and land reforms example, I would like to discuss that. Um, it is not abstract theory, but it is a reality that exists. The feudal lords, you can also call them Vaderas, or the Chaudhries, or the Sardars. Vaderas of Sindh, Chaudhries of Punjab, or the Sardars of Balochistan. These families have dominated Pakistani politics for decades, and many of them have been the member of National Assembly or Senate for multiple generations as well. The same family names, generations after generations are there. Now, the question is, why have they consistently, uh, aggressively, and successfully opposed the land reforms? It is not because they don't understand the economics, they understand it very well, let me tell you. So, land reforms would actually mean breaking up large holdings and distributing land to the tenant farmers. Tenants are basically people जिन्हें हम मुजारी भी कहते हैं. So economically, this would likely to increase the agriculture productivity. Smaller owner-operated farms tend to be more productive than the large um, tenant farmed estates. So economically, it might even benefit the country. But here is what land reforms would do politically. If the peasant who farms your land suddenly owns the law, not the law, the land, he would no longer need you. And he doesn't need to come to you for the permission to marry, to take loan, for the help with the police, for a recommendation to the hospital, and so on and so on. So his entire web of social and economic dependence on you would dissolve. And if he is economically independent, he will vote for whoever he wants to, and certainly he will not vote for you or not for your candidate. So the feudal landlord block basically shatters, and they actually were blocking the land reforms not out of some kind of ignorance, but out of backwardness. Not because they don't understand, but because they understand it very perfectly. So it is completely a rational decision from the perspective of preserving his political power. So, students, this is the logic of extractive institutions, and this is why the default state of human civilization is extractive institutions. Inclusive institutions are the exceptions, not the rule. Creating and sustaining them requires actually defeating or co-opting those political losers, which is extraordinarily difficult. So, understanding this logic is the foundation for understanding everything else in this course, not just book. I would say course, uh, such as like why foreign aid doesn't work, why good policies fail to be implemented, um, why countries that seem to reforming and improving suddenly have their reverse force. Every time, if you look carefully, you will find political losers fighting back. Now let's talk about the theory of institutional change. How do institutions actually change? How do they ever change? Because if vicious circle are so strong and poverty uh, is so prevalent, as well as powerful elites resist change so effectively, how did we ever get inclusive institutions anywhere in the world? So the author actually develops a two-part model of institutional change. And I want you to understand this model clearly because it is genuinely very elegant and very useful for analyzing what is happening in the world even today. So in part one, you will actually need to understand that what is this institutional drift. Okay, so the concept of institutional drift actually refers to the fact that institutions are not static in nature. They gradually shift over the time. They gradually drift over the time, even without any some big dramatic event. So small changes accumulate, a court ruling here, a new law there, a shift in the balance of power within the elites. It could be some new working class emerging, some kind of religious transformation as well that would change the behavior of people or the social attitudes. All this is small drifts. So these small drifts happen at different speeds and in different directions in different countries. Over the time, over the decades, over the centuries, I would say, countries that started at similar places end up at somewhere different places because of their drift changes. So these differences may seem small at any given point, but they matter enormously when the next big event hits. So drop by drop, the sea is coming. Um, the next thing that you need to understand are the critical junctures. Okay, these are basically the major shocks or events that dis- destabilize the existing systems or the existing equilibriums. They shake up the existing power structures and open up the space for the institutional change, such as a plague that would kill a third of the population, could be a revolution, could be a major war, it could be a discovery of a new trade route, it could be some new technology that has disrupts the existing economic arrangements. It could even be a financial crisis. So, at a critical juncture, the normal rules of the games are disrupted. The existing power structure is under stress, and at that moment, the small differences that have accumulated during the drift period suddenly become decisive. A country that drifted towards slightly stronger property rights might respond to the crisis by building more inclusive institutions. A country that drifted towards more concentrated power might respond by doubling down on extraction. So, the model is that institutions drift slowly, which leads to critical junctures. which would actually lead to countries' divergence dramatically in nature, but it again depends upon where they stand. So, importantly, the author of this book has emphasized that outcomes are critical junctures and not something that is predetermined. They are partly contingent in nature, which means that there is genuine uncertainty, there is genuine uh, there is some genuine uncertainty, there's some genuine room for human agency. You can call it in the form of leadership or choice as well. So history could have gone differently at many points, and this whole theory of drift and critical junctures actually has performed differently in different civilizations. So this is an important philosophical point, and the theory does not say that poor countries are doomed. It says that they face structural obstacles which are rooted in history, and that makes the change difficult. But the change is possible because leadership matters, coalitions matter, movements matter, the small drift changes matter. Okay, let me give you an example. 1947, Pakistan is made. That is a critical juncture. A new state, rather a blank state, relatively speaking, and the choices made in those first years had enormous long term consequences. What were the key choices? Such as that the land reforms was not seriously pursued. The feudal land holding structures in Sindh and Punjab were left largely intact, which means that the pre independence ruler power structure carried over the new state. The military embedded itself in state institutions very early, and this actually happened because of the Kashmir crisis, I would say, which emerged immediately after the independence. Civil bureaucracy, which is an inherited colonial structure designed for control and not service, was not actually restructured. So these were not some inevitable choices. They were choices made by specific people at specific moments. So these choices that the powerful group of the time preferred. And those choices have shaped everything that came after. Even the political crisis, any military coup, um, every governance failure, all of it came out against the background of those foundational institutional choices which were made at 1947. Understanding this does not make us some some very idealistic, but it actually opens up our eyes about what needs to change and how deep the change needs to go. Transition to inclusive institutions. This is one of the most important questions in the entire book, and the authors are entirely, I would say, I would say that I would admire the authors because this question that where do inclusive institutions actually come for is very difficult to answer. Extractive institutions have been the norm throughout the human history, as you know. When you look at the full sweep of recorded history, I would say, such as, you talk about ancient empires, you talk about medieval kingdoms, you talk about colonial regimes, the dominant pattern is extraction, where a small group of, the elite class or top, the ruling class are extracting the resources and labors from the broader population. So Inclusive institutions are the exception. They are the rare, precious, hard won. Question is, how did they ever emerge anywhere? Let's talk about some early attempts to have inclusive institutions. Um, let's talk about the uh, Roman Empire or Roman Republic. Um, the Roman Republic, if we talk about, they had, initially they had the elements of political inclusion, where they had, a senate, they had elected people, there were some rules of laws and will, and there were some checks on power as well. So when it's in its golden age, roughly you can talk about it in 10th to 13th centuries, had remarkably, I would say that, shown that inclusive economic institutions emerged, such as contract law, um, banking system, you can say, partnerships, broad participation in trade, and these were actually some general achievements that had been celebrated, um, but they were ultimately reversed, and this attempt was failed. The Roman Republic became the Roman Empire. It became empire because the power was concentrated in one man. The Senate was reduced to just a rubber stamp. When it gradually closed its political system, if you recall, that is the, as the book says, it is Sedita of 1297. 1297, yes. So, which restricted membership of the Great Council to, you can say, existing noble families and froze out some new entrants. So, economic decline followed political closure, and this pattern is consistent. Inclusive institutions, when they emerge early, were ultimately captured and reversed by those who actually stood to gain from extractive power. The political losers were discussed earlier, fought back, and won. So the crucial turning point of the Glorious Revolution of 1688 is also very important because I would call this Glorious Revolution as one of, you know, uh, not just, a turning point, but also a critical juncture. When in 1688, the English Parliament got fed up with the King James II because he was actually attempting at the Catholic absolutism, and he invited the Dutch Prince William of Orange to invade. So James actually fled. William and his wife was Mary, were crowned uh, at that place, and they were actually labeled as joint monarchs. But under explicit constitutional conditions that fundamentally changed the relationship between the crown and parliament was important. So, what changed specifically? The king actually could no longer raise taxes without parliament's consent. So, the king could no longer maintain a standing army in a peacetime without the parliament's approval. The independence of judiciary was strengthened, religious toleration was extended, censorship of the press was reduced. So these might sound like some, technical details, but they were revolutionary in their implications, in their impact. For the first time in England, and arguably anywhere of this significant scale, there was a credible legacy enforced constraints on what the rulers could do. So property rights became genuinely secure. Entrepreneurs could invest knowing that the king couldn't just take their wealth arbitrarily, and the political opening led directly to the economic opening. Patent laws were strengthened. Inventors could profit from their inventions. The Bank of England was founded. Credit became available to the broader range of people. Capital markets was further developed, and these institutional changes created the conditions for the Industrial Revolution later, which actually began in 1760s and 1770s, within a century of, you can say, glorious revolution. Not in France, not in Spain, not in Ottoman Empire, in Britain, because of these institutional differences. I like, giving you some insights for while discussing the case of Pakistan as well, because um, certainly since we are in Pakistan, so we would actually learn. We would actually like to learn that how this is relatable to Pakistan. So Pakistan's, if you talk about Pakistan, Pakistan has inherited the colonial institutions as well, where you have a bureaucracy, you have a legal system, and a land revenue system. Uh, these systems were designed by the British not to serve the large population, but to govern and extract from a subject people. The Indian civil service was explicitly modeled on distance and authority, and not on accountability and service. So we inherited that structure in 1947, and we have never fundamentally restructured it. The district management group still operates in a way that would be recognized to colonial era somehow. The land revenue records are still in many places the same documents the British created. The relationship between the citizens and the state official is still often one of the subject and ruler, and not really a citizen and servant. So this is not an accident. This is how societies are, and after some critical or drift changes, institutional changes happen and countries grow. These are just phases of growth. The powerful group in Pakistan society, for example, you can call them the landed elite or the higher bureaucracy, have benefited from this so-called British inherited structure and have consistently blocked some genuine institutional reforms. Understanding this is actually beginning of the wisdom about uh, the changes that can happen in future, or that needs to happen in future. Okay, this slide of institutional divergence at a critical juncture is also very interesting, because here we actually are discussing that how the same shock produces opposite outcomes. And this is one of the most intellectual and satisfying case study in this book, I would say, because it is so clearly demonstrating the central mechanism, which is that the same external shock can produce completely opposite institutional outcomes depending on the some kind of pre-existing institutional context. So the Black Death, which is the greatest shock in the European history. The Black Death struck Europe in 1347, and it went till 1351. It killed by nearly one third, and some say that one half of the Europe's entire population. In some cities, mortality was even higher than one half. So it was the greatest demographic catastrophe in the recorded European history, I would say. Whole villages were depopulated. The labor force contracted very dramatically. Now, the basic economic logic says that if labor becomes scarce, it becomes more valuable because supply falls, so prices would rise. Workers, peasants, serfs, craftsmen should have more bargaining power, and they should be able to demand better wages and better conditions. But in Western Europe, England, France, the Low Countries, this is exactly what happened. Peasants demanded and got better conditions. They left the ones whom they were working before with and improved in terms of manners that were possible. Feudal obligations such as labor services which were owed to the lord weakened because lords could not enforce them without armies or serfs. So feudalism in Western Europe began to crumble after Black Death. Not immediately, not completely, but the trajectory was very clear. The opposite has happened in the Eastern Europe. Eastern Europe were having countries such as the Poland, uh, Prussia, Russia, Bohemia. So in these 4 to 5 countries, which is the Eastern Europe, this shock has some exact opposite response. After the Black Death, landlords actually tightened their control over peasants. They pushed through laws that tied peasants to land more formally. They restricted their movements. They increased their labor obligations. So, Black Death basically, the landlords actually tightened their control over the peasants. They pushed through laws that tied peasants to the land more formally. They restricted their movements. They increased their labor obligations. And historians and economists call this as the second serfdom as well. Serfdom that was in many ways more restrictive and coercive than the feudalism that existed before the Black Death, the Black. So the question is that why same shock but opposite outcomes? The answer is because the pre-existing institutional differences meant different to the different playgrounds. The pre-existing institutional differences meant the shock played out very differently in different playgrounds. In Eastern Europe, uh, peasants' communities were weaker and less organized. So there had been less history of peasant, you can say peasant resistance or collective actions. Landlords, landlords, they were actually more powerful relative to the state. So in many Eastern European territories, the nobility, which was essentially was the state, and there were no significant royal or judiciary, counterweights. And not only that, but if you talk about the economic context, that was very different as well. Because in Eastern Europe, agriculture was oriented towards exporting grain to the West, uh, which gave landlords commercial incentives to attract even more labor rather than having less labor. So when the labor becomes scarce because of this plague, Western Europe landlords had to compete for workers by offering them, the better terms, better incomes, better pays. So Eastern Europe, uh, the landlords in the Eastern Europe responded by using their political power to actually legalize or to actually prevent the workers from leaving. Okay, think about what happens in the rural Pakistan when there is a flood, a drought, a crop failure, or you can say any kind of economic crisis. Who gets hurt most? The small running farmer, the daily wage laborer, or the rural poor? And where do they turn? To the local landlord, or to the local political boss, or the sardar. They go to them for a loan to help them out, or for some bureaucratic figure for relief, or even for the police to intervene. And that helps come with strings attached. Political loyalty, increased dependency, sometimes formal debt, debt that accumulates and ties future labor to the creditor, a crisis that inflames the labor market with pure property rights and proper private institutions would be a temporary setback becomes, in this institutional context, a deepening of dependency and extraction. So the same crisis, such as a flood and a drought, produces empowerment in an inclusive institutional context and deeper dependency in an extractive ones. And that is the institutional mechanism at work right here, right now in our own country. So understanding this should make us very skeptical of the idea that economic growth, aid, or investment alone will solve Pakistan's development problems. Really? Would it? Would they? Because if the institutional foundation is extractive, the additional resources often just give the elite more to extract and nothing else. Let's also discuss the case of Mexico. Mexico. What happened there, or the implications of corruption in Mexico? This slide actually presents data from the colonial Mexico that perfectly tells you that what extractive institutions do the most uh, basic economic mechanism. It is simultaneously a brilliant piece, I would say, of economic history and also very disturbing window for you because into what we now are going is the coercive labor system that actually look like in practice. This graph or the chart shows two things that are happening simultaneously in colonial Mexico between 1500s to 1650. Those two things. First one is the population collapsing dramatically, you can see. And this is due to some catastrophic impact of a European disease on some indigenous population. Some estimates suggest that 90% of this indigenous population died within a century of Spanish contact. And the second thing is that the wages for these coast workers the the forced labor system. So, the basic economic logic or the basic economics says that population collapsed, so labor would become extremely scarce, and wages should rise dramatically. This is what we have studied in labor economics, and this is what we have seen in Western Europe after the Black Death. That workers should have enormously uh, gaining, or the workers have enormously gained their bargaining power. But in colonial Mexico, nothing of the sort has happened. Wages or the workers stayed flat or actually fell even as the population. And thus the labor force collapsed catastrophically. Why? Because these workers were not free. These workers were not free wage laborers. They were coerced. So indigenous communities were required by law to provide a certain number of workers to Spanish colonizers and mining operations. And this too on some rotating basis at whatever wage the colonial authorities would set. So workers had no right to refuse, no right to seek better terms elsewhere, no legal standings to bargain. So when the population fell and the labor became scarce, what would the colonial authorities do? Yes, they would increase the coercive pressure. They demanded the same number of workers from smaller population. They increased the burden on the survivors. Scarcity, rather than raising wages, simply increased the intensity of coercion. And this is what extractive institutions do at their most fundamental level as well, that they sever the connection between productivity, scarcity, and reward. So, in a free market, scarcity of labor leads to higher wages, uh, which would lead to investment in labor system, or you can say, um, not labor system, basically, you call it labor saving technology, LST. So, in free markets, scarcity of labor would lead to higher wages, which would lead to LST, which would lead to productivity growth. So, in a coercive system, scarcity of labor just tends to be more coercive in nature. And there is no mechanism for improvement, there is no feedback loop towards growth. Think about the bounded labor in Pakistan's brick kilns. Um, the people who own it, they actually give money to workers in advance, often for something as small as a wedding loan. The worker then owes this debt, but the clean owner controls the accounts, the interest accumulates. The principal never seemed to fail, and the worker cannot leave until the debt is paid. Is never actually. Children would work alongside their parents as inheriting the debt. So, by official estimates, Pakistan has several million bonded laborers in bricklines, in carpet weaving, in agriculture in Sindh, and by some NGO estimates, the number is even large. So the workers experience exactly what you know the workers in Mexico has experienced, that their labor is coerced. Their wages are not set by some supply and demand, but by their creditors, and their scarcity or productivity goes, uh, you know, unincentivized. So there is debt bondage, There is lack of access to goods. The dependence on same people for shelter and credit, and this removes all their bargaining power. And this is not a failure of market, this is the absence of market, which is replaced by curation, and it is a direct consequence of extractive institutions that protect the creditor and leave the workers with no legal recourse. So let's talk about the emergence of inclusive institutions in Britain, that why Britain and not somewhere else in the world. And in this slide, you would see that the author tries to explain why the Industrial Revolution happened in Britain specifically and not somewhere in France or Spain or China, which was technologically, we can say, more advanced than Europe for much more of the history. So, not an Ottoman Empire and not in Mughal India. The answer, as the author shows, comes down to a specific combination of initial institutional drift and a critical juncture. The initial institutional drift, which is the centuries of gradual change, shows that Britain did not arrive at 1688 by accident. It arrived there through centuries of gradual institutional change. Each step was small, each step contested, but adding up over time to fundamentally difference of power that existed in most of the Europe. Um, so in this slide, there are some cases discussed as well. The Magna Carta of 1215, where King John was forced by his barons to sign a document which acknowledges that even the king was subject to law. And this is often romanticized, but what matters institutionally is the idea that the royal power has limits. Not a democratic document, it was actually written by the nobles for nobles. But at a crucial step, the creation of parliament, which gradually over the 13th and 14th century became an established institutions through which the king negotiated taxes with his subjects, not democracy, but constraints on arbitrary royal power, you can say. King Henry, after 1485, the first Tudor king as well, who crucially established a monopoly of violence, ending the War of the Roses and establishing a more unified, centralized state. So this is important because, as the authors note, that some degree of a state centralization is very necessary for inclusive institutions. So you need a state strong enough to enforce property rights and the rule of law. You talk about the Civil War of 1640, where parliaments went to war with King Charles over his attempt to rule without parliament and raise his taxes very arbitrarily. Parliament won, Charles I was executed, and this was traumatic and chaotic. But it permanently established that the parliaments um, could not be ignored by the king. So the critical juncture is a kind of, the Atlantic trade after 1492. All of this institutional drift set the stage. Then came the critical junctures, the development of the Atlantic economy after the Columbus voyages in 1492. So Atlantic trade created enormous new wealth, but crucially, in England, the beneficiaries of this new wealth were not primarily the king or the old aristocracy. They were rather the merchants, traders, financiers, or ship owners. So a new class of economically powerful people emerged, were, were people whose wealth was based on commerce rather than the land. So people who desperately needed secure property rights, reliable contract laws, and protection from arbitrary royal seizure of their goods and ships. So, um, talk about Spain. If you compare the Spain, Spain also had Atlantic trade, arguably more spectacular Atlantic trade. The silver of Potosi, the gold of Aztecs, but in Spain the crown had monopolized colonization and the Atlantic trade. So the wealth of the Atlantic trade strengthened the Spanish crown rather than creating an independent commercial class that could challenge it. And when the same critical juncture, Atlantic trade with Spain, it became more absolute. So same external event, which is opposite to institutional outcome because of some small initial differences in how trade was organized. You can even compare Pakistan with South Korea, which is a crucial comparison. Uh, in 1950s, Pakistan and South Korea had broadly similar levels of economic development. Both poor, both post-war, both were large agriculture sectors. South Korea, under American pressure and with some specific leadership choices, implemented some genuine land reforms in the earlier 1950s. The Korean War provided the critical juncture. Uh, Singamon, despite being very authoritative in nature, implemented land reforms partly because of, you can say, the communist North was basically the redistributing land, and he needed to undercut their appeal in the South. So land was redistributed to tenant farmers, and the old landlord class was broken. Pakistan at the same time did not see some serious land reforms. There were no critical junctures. So Zulfikar Ali Bhutto made some attempts in the 1970s, but they were poorly, you can say poorly implemented and largely subverted by the landed elite. So what is the consequence? The consequence was that the South Korea rural population became economically more independent, more mobile, and more educated. They actually moved into the cities, into factories, into growing industrial economies. Pakistan's ruling population remains there in, the- in, in the fields, tied to their landlords. South Korea developed a dynamic private sector and eventually inclusive enough political institutions to actually democratize in the 1980s. But Pakistan private sector remained dominated by huge economies, and democratic institutions have never fully consolidated. So, initial institutional choices at a critical juncture, that is the post independence period, set the two countries on dramatically different paths. So, this ends our next part as well, and we would end this lecture here. And and we are still on the middle of the book, and half of the book is done and half is left. I look forward to complete the book in the next 2 3 parts. Thank you for your patience and listening to it, and I hope it was beneficial for you. Take care and Allah Hafiz.